Hi everyone, and welcome back to Kiersti's virtual classroom. Today we're going to be talking about fossils, so let's get right into it. So first of all, what is a fossil? So a fossil would be any remains, traces, or imprints of a plant or animal that are preserved in rock or sediment. And these are studied by paleontologists, not to be confused with archaeologists. So this is anything that you would find in the ground that has been well preserved by rocks or by sediment. And we've talked a little bit about fossils before when we talked about sedimentary rocks. So in sedimentary rocks, that's the only place that you're going to find fossils. And the reason for that is because with metamorphic rocks, there's too much heat and pressure, the fossils would be destroyed. And with igneous rocks, there's too much melting or heat that has occurred, and so you're going to see those kind of be disintegrated. So we're only going to see those in sedimentary rocks. So a lot of this is going to kind of focus on the sedimentary rocks as well. So paleontology, who studies fossils, is much more than just finding the dinosaur bones. So it's finding ammonites, it's finding trilobites, it's finding all sorts of different creatures that used to live on Earth that no longer do. And so this little animation shows you how an animal will die, eventually be buried. So the soft material will decay, the hard material will remain unless otherwise altered, and then it will be buried, and all kinds of geologic things can happen before it's actually dug up by paleontologists. So, like I said, paleontology is a scientific study of fossilized remains, so any fossilized animals. So that could be bats, that could be butterflies, that could be moths, it could be megalodons, it could be T-Rex, all sorts of animals that have lived on Earth. They are studied by paleontologists. They also study plants, so any flora and fauna from previous periodic geologic times will also be studied by paleontologists. They also study bacteria. These are stromatolites, any kind of bacteria that could have been living at one point and is now fossilized in the fossil record would be studied by a paleontologist. Fungi is another thing that's also studied. And the difference between a paleontologist and an archaeologist is that paleontologists study the fossilized remains, and the archaeologists will study prehistoric people and their culture. So it's a little bit different. They both dig up things, and sometimes archaeologists also dig up bones, but they're usually the bones of humans or Neanderthals, pre-humans, basically. But anything that's relatively old is going to be studied by a paleontologist. And paleontologists don't really study culture of people, so that's reserved for archaeologists. There are a few different types of fossils. We can see traces of things, we can see imprints, or we can actually see fossilized remains of the organism. So we have body fossils, which would be actually the remains of something. So that could be a fish, for instance. That could be the actual plant leaf. Depends on what you're looking at, but there could be an actual body fossil that you see. You might see trace fossils, which are evidence that the animal existed or the species existed, but not necessarily the species itself. So traces could be something like their footprints. They could be something like their poop, which is what this is. This is a coprolite, which is fossilized dinosaur poop. Or we might see pseudofossils. And pseudofossils are basically fake fossils that aren't, they don't consist of trace or body remains. They are oftentimes, they lead you to think that they're fossils, but they're from some other process. Okay, so body fossils are the first one we're going to talk about. So these are either going to come in the form of an altered remain or an unaltered remain. And it depends on if there's a chemical or physical change during fossilization. So with unaltered remains, you basically have no chemical change. There's no chemical alteration of the actual fossil. And so the fossil that you have, or whatever piece you have, is the actual species itself, just non-living. So this would be like a gastropod fossil that is unaltered. With unaltered remains, you might have the original skeletal material. So this would be the original material from an ammonite or a gastropod. And these are pretty small. These aren't really big species. Or you might see some tar impregnation. So with tar impregnation, this is where you have tar pits. So there's basically seeping petroleum to the surface. And when that occurs, a lot of times this happens in like a lake area, or animals think that it might be a source of water and they go over to it and they get stuck in the tar. And when they get stuck in the tar, they end up usually dying from lack of being pulled out of the tar, and usually they starve to death. And then once they die and their soft tissue decays, the petroleum basically replaces all of the bone material, and we call it tar impregnation. It kind of impregnates the bones. And so you'll see a lot of like saber-toothed cats or mammoths preserved in this way, especially in California, like the La Brea tar pits in LA. There's also the Fairmead landfill in Madera has a lot of the same fossils. McKittrick landfill in East California also has a lot of tar impregnated fossils. So here's a look at what the La Brea tar pits look like. There's lots of different pools of water and petroleum mixture, and these are very sticky. So if you step in it, most of them are gated off. You can kind of see a gate back here. If you step in this, you will likely get stuck. It's sort of like quicksand. You can probably get out because we have lots of ways to get out now, but animals had a very hard time because of, especially if there was no other animal around to try to help them out, to get them out. It proved to be a difficult situation. So then another unaltered remain would be amber entombment. And so this occurs when you have tree sap capturing insects. So this could be bees, this could be mosquitoes, lots of different things. They get trapped in that sap, and then eventually that sap turns into amber over time. So if that sap is buried with the insect in it, it becomes amber. It will actually preserve the entire insect in it. This is the example they used in Jurassic Park, the very first one. The reason why they were able to bring dinosaurs back was because they were able to eject or pull out blood that a mosquito had pulled from a dinosaur bite, and extrapolate that with frog DNA in order to bring back a dinosaur. So you've probably been semi-familiar with that, but this is a little bit smaller scale. A lot of these are not necessarily to that extreme. So another unaltered remain would be refrigeration. So this happens when frozen ice buries either an already dead animal or an animal that may have died in like an avalanche or something like that. But animals can be trapped in basically a glacier and freeze. So some mammoths have been frozen for thousands of years. And this is a particular baby mammoth that died about 39,000 years ago that they found fairly recently. And it was almost fully intact. Some of its fur was still there. So refrigeration is actually a really good form of preservation in a lot of species.
Reveal any clues to help explain the mammoth's extinction.
All right, so another way that fossils can be preserved is through mummification. So this is a very particular type of fossilization, and usually these are very, very fragile. And so oftentimes these are not actually on display as the actual fossil. Usually these are um, most of the time these are in the lab somewhere and then they're replicated and you see their replica on display because the replica is oftentimes a lot stronger. So here's an example of one that they found recently.
Let's see. You're looking at a skull fragment from a 75-million-year-old hadrosaur. The astounding thing about this dinosaur mummy is that some of its 2-inch thick skin remains intact. To get a better look inside the 350-pound hunk of petrified bone and soft tissue, Dr. Phil Bell is running the fossil through a CT scanner, hoping to find clues to solve this puzzle of preservation. I don't really understand how skin fossilizes because it's soft tissue. It's one of the fibers on the that's something that happens out of the section of skull and torso is very interesting about this excavations trying to find the world of this exceptional dinosaur. So far,
Okay, so moving on to altered remains. So this occurs when there is some sort of chemical or physical change to the fossil. All the previous preservations that I've talked about are all from unaltered remains. So the first one we're going to talk about is permineralization. And this has to do with the pore spaces between different, the bones or for perhaps a pine cone or something like that, something that would have pore spaces. And here we see different dissolved minerals, usually from groundwater, that seep into all those pore spaces and then it solidifies or crystallizes whatever the mineral happens to be. And so you'll see pore spaces in pine cones or in like a dinosaur bone filled with some sort of mineral. So this mode of preservation is permineralization. Another one is replacement. So this occurs when groundwater that has dissolved minerals completely replaces the organism's hard parts when they are buried. So here you see an ammonite that's been replaced with pyrite. You're pretty familiar with that mineral. And some more ammonites that are replaced with other things. It just depends on what is present in the natural surroundings of where the animal or organism was buried. So then we have recrystallization, which takes whatever the chemical component of the hard parts was originally of the organism, and it basically recrystallizes. For instance, an ammonite is heavily consistent of calcium carbonate, and when it recrystallizes below ground, it ends up forming calcite. And so you'll see calcite crystals form in some of the void spaces where the ammonite material used to be. We also see something called carbonization, which usually gives us this very red look on a very oftentimes light colored rock. So this happens when you have very rapid burial of whatever happened to die, and oftentimes there is very little oxygen present, and that basically compresses the carbon onto the sediment, and that compression onto the sediment leaves behind kind of like a carbonized footprint of the organism. Okay, so moving on from body fossils to trace fossils. With trace fossils, we're looking at something that the animal has left behind. So this can be like footprints, it can be maybe an impression of their fossils. So in this instance, we'll talk about casts and molds. So for instance, this is a cast. This is basically what would have filled in the original gastropod. It has this shape, and it would have been a shell, and sediment filled in that shell, and then the shell eventually decayed away, and you were left with the cast. So we'll talk about 5 types. So we'll talk about the cast and the mold. So the mold is what can create the cast. So this would have been sort of an impression from a fossil seed, and this would be the mold, and the cast is what fills in that void space and then is left as kind of an individual piece. So it's kind of like the mud cracks we talked about being cast in a mold, the mold being the original crack basically, and whatever filled in the crack is the cast. Okay, so then here is the cast. The next one we're going to look at is burrows. So burrows occur when you have some sort of worm type of creature that is basically burrowing, wiggling their way through sand and mud. Eventually, those can be preserved, and if they are preserved, we call them burrows, and they tell us something about how a particular species might have lived. Then we have tracks, so these can be like dinosaur tracks, they can be trilobite tracks. This is what a trilobite would actually look like. And these will tell us something about how the animal moved, what their footprint looked like, so we can kind of get some idea of how big the animal might have been, how tall, how quickly it moved, etc. Then we have their fossilized poop, which is called coprolite. These will basically there's no organic material left, but we can use their size and shape to tell us something about what they might have eaten, how they hunted, things like that. So they can be a good source for us. Okay, so I want you, normally I would do this in lecture, but I want you to take a look at these different pictures here and try to decide if you think it is a body or a trace fossil. So give it a couple minutes and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so by now you might have gotten an opportunity to figure out whether you think it is a body or a trace fossil. So let's look at A. A is definitely a footprint of some sort of maybe dinosaur or some other organism. So the footprint is usually seen as a trace fossil. Okay, so how about this guy down here? We'll jump down to C here. These look kind of like little worms, and they are burrows. You can kind of see right here, it looks like a little burrow, so remember burrows are trace fossils. Up here in the upper right, we have B, which is basically an entire turtle, not shell, but a turtle skeleton. And the turtle skeleton, because it's the actual organism, this is a body fossil. And then D down here is a tooth, maybe from a shark, maybe from a dinosaur, we're not sure. I'm not sure based on the photo, but this would be an actual body fossil because it's a portion of the organism. Okay, so next we're going to do name that preservation and see if you can figure it out. Feel free to pause the video. I'll give a 1-minute delay here just to see if you guys can figure this out on your own. Okay, so by now you might have figured it out. So here we have a saber-toothed cat or a smilodon, and this one is from tar impregnation. So this color here, this very dark, kind of a brownish, almost a burgundy kind of color, is indicative of a tar impregnation. Then down here we have something called permineralization. So the pore spaces in this petrified wood would have been replaced by something else, or minerals would have been into the pore spaces and crystallized and preserved this wood. C up here would have been amber entombment. So it's got an insect in amber. And then D is recrystallization. Okay, so then we have something called pseudofossils, which are the fake fossils, and they're not necessarily fossils as you would think they would be, but they might look something like branches, like this one down here. It looks like it's branches, but this is actually a dendrite made by a mineral. So these are not necessarily leaves of a plant or a tree or something like that. And then raindrops can technically be fossilized in soft sediments, so like mud or clay, and they'll leave little impressions in the dirt, and they can be preserved. But these are basically pseudofossils. They look like fossils, but they're not really fossils. They're not from living organisms. So how is a fossil made? So most of these are they have to be under very specific circumstances in order to be fossilized. So very few organisms actually get fossilized. There's very special conditions that are needed. So in general, we need a dead organism that gets buried very quickly in preferably soft sediments. And if they have hard parts, the more likely they are to be fossilized. If they have only soft parts, you need some sort of situation where there's little or no oxygen so that the soft parts get preserved, like in the carbonization preservation process. Okay, so now I'm going to go through each of these California fossils. So the first one here that we're going to talk about is the trilobite. This is named for having 3 lobes. It lived from about 540 to 520 million years ago from the Cambrian to the Permian. So a fairly short amount of time, but it also lived very widespread around the globe. So we consider this to be a good index fossil. An index fossil being something that lived for a short period of time, but very widespread globally. And the living relative right now is the horseshoe crab. Another one is the giant short-faced bear, and this is a relative to the grizzly, but it is much larger than the grizzly. The grizzly stands on all 4s at about 3.5 feet, but the giant short-faced bear was about 5.5 to 6 feet tall on all 4s. And it lived between 1.8 million years ago to 11,000 years ago. Then we have the Smilodon, which is the California state fossil. They lived about 5 million years ago, And this guy is actually relatively short. He's not as tall as a lot of people think he is. He's about 41 inches in height, so a little bit shorter, actually a lot shorter than the bear is. And it's much more muscular than any other feline species. And those front canines were used to dig into predators. A lot of the time it went into arteries, hopefully allowing the animal to bleed out so then it could scavenge the rest of it. Then we have the mammoth, which lived in the Pleistocene. Stands about 5 meters in height. It's very large, much larger than your African or Asian elephant. And they're found a lot in the La Brea tar pits and the Fairmead landfill in Madeira. Then we have the plesiosaur. So the plesiosaur is basically Nessie. It's the Loch Ness monster. But it lived around 203 million years ago, and it looks like a sea monster. So it has fin paddles and a very, very long neck. So long neck with paddle front and back limbs, and it was up to 49 feet in length. So they can be very, very large. Then we have the mosasaur, which is one of those, that big alligator-looking dinosaur they have in the Jurassic World movies that kind of acts like Free Willy for Jurassic World purposes. But this guy lived about 145 to 61.7 million years ago, and they ranged from 33 to 59 feet in length, so very large, much larger than your average crocodile. So this is a crocodile and this is an alligator, just to give you reference for length. And they were up to 30,000 pounds, so very, very large. Then we have the hadrosaur, which lived between 85.8 million years ago and 66 million years ago. And they stood at about 10 feet in height. And they were about 15,000 to 18,000 pounds in weight. They were herbivores, so they fed off of, trees and leaves and plants and things like that. They would have been eaten by a T-Rex, like you see in the background here. And that's it for our fossils. So I will see you next time in my next lecture video. Bye!